Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Czech National Bank, let me welcome you to a quarterly meeting with analysts, which is aimed mainly at presenting and discussing our brand new forecast. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. There are two members of the bank board with us today, Mr. Vojtěch Benda and Mr. Marek Mora. As always, present is also Monetary Department Executive Director Tomáš Holub. I'm quite sure that none of us has missed the news from yesterday that the Czech National Bank raised its interest rates for the third time since August. No less interesting is the fact that we have resumed publishing our outlook for the exchange rate of the koruna against the euro. The new forecast, which provided arguments for the rate decision yesterday, will be now presented to you by Tomáš Holub. Tomáš, the floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. It is my pleasure to present to you our new forecast. As Markéta has already mentioned, this was a long-awaited forecast because with it we resumed the publication of the exchange rate pass, and thus we returned to full transparency of our projections, which was the standard before we introduced the exchange rate commitment in November 2013. So let me describe this forecast to you and explain the main elements. As always, I will start briefly with assumptions of the forecast, then I will describe the main features of the new forecast itself, compare it in a few slides with the previous forecast, and finally I will present to you an exchange rate sensitivity scenario, the publication of which is closely related to the resumed publication of the exchange rate pass. Speaking about the external assumptions of the forecast, they are quite optimistic regarding the growth of foreign economic activity and thus the growth of foreign demand for Czech exports. We all know that currently growth in the euro area is quite strong, robust and broad-based, reaching roughly 3% in trade-weighted terms at the end of last year and at the beginning of this year. The market consensus implies some deceleration of economic growth in the euro area going forward, but it's still going to be relatively swift, so the convergence is from above 2% to 2%, so a relatively good outlook. As regards price developments abroad, there will probably be a temporary slowdown in the producer price dynamics in year-on-year terms at the beginning of this year, but this will really be quite short-lived, and our forecast assumes that PPI price growth will recover soon to slightly more than 2% annually, reflecting the current high oil price and to some extent also increasing economic activity in the euro area. We have actually adjusted the PPI outlook somewhat in the upward direction compared to mechanically taking the consensus, because we believe that the robust economic dynamics in the euro area will start feeding into the prices more strongly than the average outlook implies. On the other hand, CPI price growth in the euro area is still below the ECB's definition of price stability, the inflation below but close to 2%. So the ECB keeps its monetary policy very expansionary. You may remember that the previous forecast did not include the extension of QE at 30 billion euro per month until September this year. We already discussed this extension at the previous meeting with you because at that time it was already a new piece of information, but this is the first forecast that incorporates that decision. In spite of the policy divergence between the United States, which are in the ongoing process of policy normalization, and on the other hand, the ECB keeping monetary policy very loose, the outlook for the US dollar-euro exchange rate is flat at just below 120. We all know that currently euro is actually stronger than this level, but this is not incorporated in our forecast so far. As regards fiscal policy, we expect that last year's budget surplus will continue roughly at the same level also in 2018 and maybe increase marginally relative to GDP in 2019. This will be backed by ongoing structural surpluses of the government budgets, which will be supported by continuous, rather robust growth of government income related both to the ongoing economic growth and to policy measures aimed at reducing tax evasion and some increases in the excise taxes. The government consumption will grow by 2.5% in 2018 and will be only slightly less dynamic in 2019. Here I emphasize that this is the number in real terms, because in nominal terms government consumption is growing much faster, but most of this is due to increases in government's wage bill, which goes also to the government consumption deflator. But it doesn't mean that this money does not support economic growth. It's not supporting it via government consumption, but rather via household consumption, which you can see here. For this year, we assume a relatively strong, not extremely strong, but reaching about 0.5 percentage point of GDP fiscal impulse, contribution of fiscal policy to annual GDP growth, and a larger part, 0.3, goes via private consumption because of these increases in government wage bill, but also due to some increases in social security measures, accelerated indexation of pensions, etc. And on top of that, there will be also a contribution of government investment related to a recovery in the drawdown of EU money. For 2019, we, at least for the moment, assume zero fiscal impulse, which partly reflects the fact that there is no government that could be taking discretionary measures. Zero fiscal impulse means an assumption that the budget will develop in line with the overall macroeconomic environment with no fiscal discretion. Of course, this may change over time, but there are no well-specified measures for the moment that we could include into the forecast. As regards the forecast itself, we expect that inflation will stay above our 2% inflation target this year, but will return to it from above at the start of the monetary policy horizon, which means at the turn of 2019. And then in 2019, it will mostly be just below the 2% inflation target. GDP growth will be slowing down too from last year's elevated levels, but will nevertheless remain above 3% both this year and the next. And it will be driven by robustly growing domestic demand, mainly household consumption and foreign investment. But of course, this will be happening in the environment of growing foreign demand. So the foreign environment will be also contributing positively. The ongoing growth in economic activity will, of course, lead to further increases in the demand for labor. But we are already in a rather tight labor market situation. So this will obviously support quite robust wage dynamics. As regards the monetary variables, the long-awaited exchange rate forecast implies that koruna will appreciate further. The main factor will be widening positive interest rate differential, plus the ongoing ECB's quantitative easing program. Of course, also the real economic convergence will play a role, which is related to faster growth of labor productivity in the Czech Republic compared to the euro area. And interest rates will rise further, so this combination of appreciating exchange rate, rising interest rates, will ensure that inflation will return to the target. Before I get to the inflation forecast itself, let me just mention that so far inflation has been driven mainly by two components, core inflation and food prices. The contribution of core inflation declined visibly at the end of 2017. This is because of fading effects of the one-off factors from the turn of 2017 related to the introduction of electronic sales registration in restaurants. So this was quite expected, and this will of course affect core inflation dynamics already also in the first months of 2018. So this effect will be fading out fully. There was also some slowdown in imputed trends, which is a little bit puzzling for us because anecdotic evidence suggests that new housing prices continue to grow quite swiftly. So we don't know what is exactly behind this, and we will be watching if this trend continues. Going forward, we actually expect that an increased contribution to inflation will come from regulated prices, which will resume their growth this year due to increases in electricity and natural gas prices, accompanied with ongoing growth of other regulated items. On the other hand, the contribution of core inflation and food prices will go down this year. Overall, as I said, we expect that headline inflation will stay above 2% inflation target. This year will return back to it at the turn of 2019, which is the beginning of monetary policy horizon currently, and then at the monetary policy horizon will be just below 2%. This is also related to the fact that we assume that regulated prices in 2019 will slow down their growth to less than 2% in 2019 because of an assumed declining trend in oil price and natural gas price. We know that currently the price of Brent is close to $70 per barrel, and at the end of 2019 we assume roughly $60 per barrel. So there is a slowdown in regulated price growth in our forecast for 2019, which contributes to this marginally below target inflation. And also there is a part of the forecast is declining fuel prices in 2019 as a result of this assumed decline in global energy prices. So this is a really rather small downward deviation, and it's mainly supply driven. Here you can see it, actually what I said, the regulated price growth is expected to exceed 2% during 2018 because of this increase in electricity and natural gas price, and then again slow down a little bit in 2019. And for fuel prices, you can see some revival in their growth during this year, which will be a reflection of the recent increase in the oil price, which is being only partially offset by appreciation of Czech koruna against US dollar. But in 2019, with the assumed decline in US dollar oil price and some very gradual ongoing appreciation of the currency, we have actually declining fuel prices. The two really key segments of inflation for core, as I mentioned, we assumed some ongoing deceleration. First of all, this is due to fading of the one-off effects which were lifting inflation last year. And then speaking about the fundamentals, the main driver would be the already observed and ongoing appreciation of Czech koruna, impacting mainly on the prices of tradable goods. On the other hand, of course, core inflation will be affected in the upward direction by domestic inflation pressures related to rising domestic economic activity and swiftly growing wages. But then for 2019, we actually expect some recovery of core inflation toward 2%, reflecting renewed growth in import prices after the appreciation of Czech koruna slows down and foreign producer prices continue increasing. For food prices, we have like a more gradual deceleration over the whole forecast horizon, which will be associated with an expected or assumed slowdown in the agriculture commodity prices, which have been growing quite fast recently, but we assume that this growth will slow down. And of course, food is tradable good, so there will be also some dampening impact from the appreciating currency. Speaking about the story regarding fundamental inflation pressures in our core forecasting model, the current inflation pressures are still assessed as quite strong overall, but their peak actually came already in the middle of 2017, and now they're moderating gradually. And the main reason why they are moderating is the anti-inflationary effect of import prices, which is visible in the negative red bars in the upper chart. While the domestic inflation pressures are actually quite strong and will be peaking only now, we believe. Later on, we actually expect that even the domestic inflation pressures will ease because the wage growth will still be robust but less pronounced than at the moment, and also we have some slower growth of private investment compared to the current rather strong pace. And this, together with a slowdown in the GDP growth, will also mean that the contribution of the price of capital to the domestic inflation pressure will gradually diminish. On the other hand, in 2019, as I mentioned, with much slower appreciation of the currency and ongoing price growth abroad, import prices will start to have a slightly positive contribution to domestic marginal costs again. As regards the GDP outlook, I mentioned that we expect a slowdown from last year's very strong growth, which we believe reached roughly 4.5%. But overall, the pace of economic expansion will still remain above 3% in the next 2 years. And the growth will be fueled by robust domestic demand. As I mentioned, foreign demand will be supportive too, but the contribution of net exports will actually turn negative in 2019, contribution to the Czech GDP growth, because of some impact of stronger exchange rate and a speed up of import growth related to mainly to fast growth of investment, together with ongoing growth in household consumption. And here you can see the breakdown. You can see that we believe that household consumption growth will peak at slightly more than 5% this year. Then it will gradually slow down, but will nevertheless still remain quite solid. And it will be, of course, reflecting ongoing increases in wages, salaries, but also in other sources of household income. The growth in investment is associated with the expected recovery in government investment related to accelerated drawdown of EU funds. But we also expect that private investment will continue growing and will be supporting growth in labor efficiency or labor productivity, if you want. And we have some temporary slowdown in export dynamics related to several factors. Appreciated exchange rate for sure is one of them. A bit weaker growth of demand for cars in Western Europe may be another one, and the labor market bottlenecks may be the third one. But overall, we expect that that export growth will be relatively strong, benefiting from the ongoing increases in foreign demand. General unemployment rate. We keep saying that unemployment rate is already so low that it cannot decline any further. We are being continuously surprised to the downside. The decline persists, but now we are already convinced that the point is coming, and we actually forecast some further decline toward 2%. But it's hard for us to imagine that it could be below that, but well, let's see. And of course, there will be some ongoing growth in the number of employees because of growing participation in the labor force, increasing pension age, etc. But definitely it needs to slow down compared to the recent fast growth rates, which were close to 2%, and the economic growth will thus have to rely more on productivity increases and investment into more productive capital. The tightness of the labor market is visible in the wage growth. We expect that the wage growth will peak close to 8% in nominal terms in the private sector during this year. But for the longer end, we assume or expect that wage growth will moderate to about 5%, which is the equilibrium long-run level assumed in our model, because of slowing economic growth, and also because of the pressure on companies to maintain their price competitiveness in an environment of appreciated exchange rate and ongoing increases in wages. So this is the highlight. Of course, you saw it yesterday at the press conference. I'm sure no one missed that opportunity. In the last discussions here with you, I always said that we tend to have a relatively front-loaded appreciation of the exchange rate and as a result, relatively backloaded increases in nominal interest rates. And this story is still plays here. So I hope that it didn't take you fully by surprise. Of course, I have to add all the disclaimers. This is not a commitment. This is not our preferred path. This is what comes out of our model, which is consistent with all the assumptions of the forecast, including assumptions about foreign variables. This is not something that we would like to see. It's purely revealing the full story of the forecast. And there is actually a kind of close link between the exchange rate path and the interest rate path. Those are two sides of the same coin. And that's why by revealing the exchange rate forecast, we believe that we give you better understanding of our future monetary policy. There is, however, some difference between exchange rate forecast and interest rate forecast. Interest rate is our tool which is in our hands. The exchange rate is something, very important endogenous variable, but something that we cannot affect directly in the floating exchange rate regime. Going back to the chart as such, the further appreciation of koruna will reflect one divergence and one convergence. Divergence between Czech monetary policy and monetary policy in the euro area. We are already well into the policy normalization process, while euro area maintains its accommodative monetary policy and will continue to do so probably for most of this year. And the convergence part is the long-term convergence story, faster economic growth in the Czech Republic relative to the euro area, associated with a positive differential in labor productivity growth. Then for 2019, we assume a slowdown in the appreciation because the partly implicit, partly explicit assumption of the forecast is that in 2019, the ECB will already be in its own policy normalization process, and this divergence in monetary policy will no longer be a key driver of the exchange rate. Consistent with the forecast is a further rise in domestic interest rates this year and especially next year. The word especially is the reflection of the front-loaded increases in interest rates into 2019. Again, there is this impact of the ECB's accommodative policy, which will be slowing down, which will be a kind of constraint on further interest rate hikes this year, according to the forecast. But once this constraint becomes less binding, less serious in 2019, we have like faster move back towards the assumed policy neutral level. We will most probably not reach the policy neutral level by the end of 2019, however, because this process of policy normalization, of course, needs to be gradual, and also the euro area policy normalization process will most probably be quite gradual. I think I'm a little bit over time, so I will go very briefly through the comparison with the previous forecast because the changes are actually quite small. Here is the summary. I'll skip it. I'll go by one by one. You can see that CPI outlook is slightly lower for this year. This is because we observed lower than expected core inflation at the end of 2017. And on top of that, the previous forecast included the next two phases of electronic sales registration for 2018. And now after the decision of the Constitutional Court, we had to remove it from the forecast. So it's not something very fundamental. The fundamental inflation pressures are actually now assessed as slightly stronger than in the previous forecast. For 2019, there is only a very small, almost negligible downward shift in the forecast, and it's related to the fact that regulated price outlook is a bit lower for 2019 than we previously assumed, while for 2018 regulated price growth is actually increased a little bit relative to the previous assumption. GDP forecast is overall slightly stronger. This reflects more optimistic outlook of external demand, which I was showing at the beginning of this presentation, and also stronger fiscal impulse for this year. In spite of the fact that in the third quarter of 2017 we were surprised by the nominal wage growth in the market sector slightly to the downside, we have actually increased a little bit the outlook for 2018 and 2019, which is supported by the slightly faster GDP growth, faster assumed increases in labor efficiency related to observed acceleration in fixed investment by the corporate sector, which took us positively by surprise. And also the higher external demand outlook is, of course, contributing to this mild upward revision of the wage projection. This environment of faster growth in labor efficiency domestically on the one hand, and on the other hand a little bit more accommodative ECB's monetary policy once we included the extension of the quantitative easing, leads us to a slight downward revision of the exchange rate outlook at the end of the forecast horizon. Here I'm actually revealing not just the current exchange rate forecast, but also the previous one. So we're actually doing more than what we promised on the transparency side. And as regards the interest rate forecast, there is only a small upside shift for this year, and a little bit more gradual pace of policy normalization for 2019. With the resumed publication of the exchange rate path, we actually resume also publishing analytical decomposition of what fundamental factors stand behind these changes in the interest rate path. For the near term, we have two upside factors. First, a little bit more inflationary foreign environment, and the short-term exchange rate forecast, which is weaker than what the previous forecast implied. But on the other hand, the initial state of the domestic economy, including faster increases in labor efficiency, are a downside factor. And this downside factor then dominates for 2019, partly because the faster increases in labor efficiency push on the stronger exchange rate, which I showed in one of the previous slides. And finally, the last element, the publication of which we resume with the exchange rate outlook, is the standard exchange rate sensitivity scenario, which shows what would happen in our model if the starting exchange rate was either 3% weaker or 3% stronger then the assumption of the forecast, the interest rate in the current quarter would not respond to it, and then it shows us what would be the appropriate monetary policy reaction according to the model and what would be the overall implications for the key macro variables such as CPI inflation and GDP growth. In the last 3 or 4 years, when we were not publishing this sensitivity scenario, you were asking questions about the strengths of the exchange rate pass-through. I was always saying it depends what kind of shock is it, but if it's a kind of non-fundamental exchange rate shock like this, the pass-through into inflation in the model is slightly less than 10%. So here, if we shift the exchange rate temporarily by 3%, either up or down, inflation in the relevant horizon is up or down roughly by 0.2 of a percentage point. So the impact is relatively small, but of course it's partly due to the fact that monetary policy in the model responds to the shock to offset its impact. So if this shows clearly that if exchange rate is weaker compared to our forecast, it would imply some more increases in the interest rates this year than what is currently factored into the baseline scenario. We view this risk as rather symmetric, but of course we are aware of the fact that market consensus implies, relative to our forecast, more gradual exchange rate appreciation, and consistently with this, like more steady increases, more front-loaded increases in the domestic nominal interest rates. And that's all from my side. I apologize for talking a little bit longer than usual, but I believe that the resumed publication of the exchange rate forecast is a good occasion for that. So thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Tomáš, for your presentation. Let's move on to the Q&A part now. Before you ask a question, I would like to ask you to make sure that your microphone is on, and also please introduce yourselves. Okay, let's proceed to the first round of 2 to 3 questions. Viktor Zeisel, Komerční banka.
Viktor Zeisel, Komerční banka. Thank you for the presentation. I only have, I have questions about the exchange rate, not surprisingly. We see that there is a really pretty steep appreciation in the second quarter, but there are no hikes which would actually trigger it. What would be the trigger for the exchange rate appreciation when the market is already pricing in some 40 basis point increase in interest rates? And well, maybe the question is, do you actually include into your forecast this market pricing of your policy? Or is it only like that the interest rate differential would move after yesterday's hike? And actually, we do not see any interest rate differential like widening through the forecast by the end of the year. And my question to the board members is that we heard board members even before this meeting talking about 2 hikes this year, almost surely. And yesterday, Governor Rusnok also talked about very probable hike in the remainder of the year, but the forecast actually doesn't suggest any increase in interest rates. We see that the average of interest rates in the first quarter and the last quarter of this year in the forecast remains the very same. So thank you for the quick answers.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, please.
Martin Pohl, General Investments. I have a question regarding the interest rates forecast. I'm a bit struggling with the new interest rate path. Why there is such a big drop, especially in the part for 2019. In the decomposition, it's related mainly to the initial state of the economy, and Mr. Holub, you mentioned the trade-off with the exchange rate, labor market efficiency, but in the 2019, the drop is almost like 45 basis points, more or less, for the fourth quarter, and I don't see it really why the drop is so big, even taking slightly stronger exchange rate into the consideration.
Okay, thank you. Let me close the first round and ask Tomáš Holub to reply to the first question, if he can.
Yeah, well, regarding the technical part of Viktor's question, the model has endogenous interest rate, so market expectations are more or less assumed to be in line with the interest rate outlook, which is part of the story. But the model is at the same time quite forward-looking. So the interest rate differential does not start affecting the exchange rate only once it happens, but the market starts responding well ahead of it. So it's taking into account that the exchange rate in 2018 is not taking into account just the interest rate differential in 2018, but also the expected outlook for 2019. We still have in the model the impact of the quantitative easing via the shadow rates of the ECB, and altogether, of course, there is also some impact of the improved foreign trade balance in real terms last year. So altogether, this like concentrates much of the appreciation into the first half of 2018. Of course, we don't say that this must necessarily happen. If the exchange rate continues appreciating more gradually, like what people expect, then also the interest rate increases could be above what, or on top of what we have in the baseline scenario. That's quite sure. And then maybe about interpreting the forecast in terms of the interest rates. The forecast, it's quarterly averages. So to achieve the forecasted interest rate for the first quarter of 2019, which is higher compared to what we have in 2018, you would actually need to start hiking the rates either in November or December this year. So a kind of interpretation of what the forecast suggests is that there is a hike which we delivered now, and then maybe it's consistent with the hike in during the fourth quarter, which would mainly be affecting the average interest rate in 2019. Because to affect the interest rate in the first quarter of 2019, you cannot hike in March 2019. That's and well, the appreciation of, the less pronounced rate increase at the end of 2019. Well, actually, for me, it's quite consistent with the stronger exchange rate outlook. The exchange rate is stronger at the end of the forecast horizon by about 1%. So even in terms of the monetary conditions, this is roughly equivalent to one interest rate hike or cut. Of course, this is just a rule of thumb. And overall, I don't view this change of the interest rate forecast as so big for the end of 2019. This is still a relatively distant time horizon. I think the policymakers have more uncertainty of how many hikes we will deliver this year, more than what we would, how much we would hike by the end of 2019. So maybe they could follow up on this.
Thank you, Tomáš. And now both Wojciech Benda and Marek Mora will comment on the second question by Viktor Zeiss.
Thank you, Markéta. Just briefly commenting on the exchange rate forecast, if you look at the page 20 of the presentation, you see, in fact, that the probability interval for the forecast in the end of 2019 ranges from somewhere 22 to 28 or 27. So this uncertainty is very huge. Everybody who ever tried to predict the exchange rate know this is a big challenge and almost impossible mission to do the forecast for 2-year horizon. So this is only a forecast, and it can be different. And of course, we will very carefully, cautiously follow the development of the exchange rate, and the interest rate setting will be appropriate to the development of the exchange rate, whether the forecast is going to fulfill or whether the exchange rate is going to divert from the central line on our forecast. Just regarding the rate hikes or the future development on the interest rate, as you mentioned yesterday, we highlighted two main risks, or two main uncertainties in our forecast. One is the size and the strength of domestic inflationary pressures, current domestic inflationary pressures and future domestic inflationary pressures. It's worth to mention that the consensus of the Bank Board is that it's a symmetric risk on both sides. The second uncertainty is what I mentioned earlier, it's the exchange rate development. So looking into very distant horizon of 1 year, it's very difficult now to say how steep or what's the frequency of the interest rate changes. So far, since October, we have increased the interest rates by 50 basis points, and the koruna appreciated by more than roughly 2%. As Tomáš mentioned, the rule of thumb that a 1% change of exchange rate equals roughly 25 basis points in interest rate. So the monetary conditions tightened since October by 100 basis points. So I think it's quite strong tightening. And now we have to very carefully watch whether the uncertainties I have mentioned, how they will develop, how they will change, whether the forecast of the wages, of the wage growth will fulfill, or whether there will be divergence from the forecast, and it will really have the influence of our decision future. But I would not really say a strong commitment regarding the interest rates in the end of 2018 or not even the 2019. It's a really too far horizon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before answering your question on my opinion, let me just turn your attention to the very detailed and educative box on the renewed publication of the exchange rate forecasts, which says on page number 5 that there is also another box in inflation report number 1 in 2009, which explains very well, in my view, exactly what Tomáš tried to explain to you, how does our G3 model works with the exchange rate path. So I think it's very good to read it, and we make an explicit reference to it in our box. Now to your question on what we said before and how to interpret it. What I said was that I think there could be 2 hikes this year, one in February, which happened yesterday, and another one at the end of the year. I based my statement on the previous forecast, which more or less foresaw it. Now there is a small shift at the end of the year. The current forecast thinks that it should be rather in the first quarter in 2019, but I don't see that there is a major difference. So I basically wanted to describe what we forecasted in our in our what we had in our forecast.
Okay, thank you for all the comments, and now it's time to ask maybe further 2 or 3 questions. Yes, please.
Hello, Gábor Ambrus from NatWest Markets. First, I've got 2 questions. One is, has your confidence in the model implied FX forecast changed compared with the unpublished forecast? So do you feel more confident that it's more reasonable to expect now that FX converges somewhere towards the model implied forecast than in the past? Do you see less uncertainty around your forecast than, let's say, 2-3 quarters ahead? That's one of the questions. The other question is for each of you, what you believe each is the single biggest risk to the broad economic forecast. It seems to be a pretty Goldilocks type scenario that is described in the forecast. Unemployment coming down, economy is doing well. Roughly everything seems to be okay. Where you think the biggest upset could be to that fairly benign scenario that is implied in the model? Thank you.
Thank you. And the final question for this time being, anyone eager? Yes.
Jaromír Šindel, City. I would ask to a little bit elaborate about this 3 months PRIBOR recomposition, and frankly I didn't get this upward move from the short-term exchange rate forecast. So if you can a little bit elaborate why it, let's say, has so long impact for a whole year. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for now. And Ms. Tomáš, would you like to react?
Well, the publication of the exchange rate is, of course, meant primarily as an act of transparency, which should help you to better understand the forecast and the policy outlook. But indirectly, it may work as a kind of stabilizing mechanism, at least in the sense that if you, for example, see that exchange rate starts deviating from our forecast to the strong side and all other things are unchanged, it's fair to start expecting slower interest rate increases. And if market starts expecting slower rate hikes, it means that longer-term interest rate should be declining, and longer-term interest rate should be a factor working against any further appreciation of the currency. So this could be a kind of self-stabilizing mechanism. We observed elements of this behavior before November 2013, during the 4-year period in which we were publishing the exchange rate forecast. That's why we wanted to get back to it. We believe that it has also this value added. But even with it, of course, the future errors in exchange rate forecasts were huge. The Fenn chart, which was cited by Vojta, and which is very wide, it's based on our forecast errors prior to the exchange rate commitment, because it would make no sense to take into account the low volatility environment of the exchange rate during the exchange rate commitment. That was a completely different regime. So the width of the bands in the confidence interval tells you how big uncertainty is there surrounding the exchange rate projection, even if it gets published.
Thank you, Tomáš, and maybe Vojtěch Benda would like to comment on the risks to broad economic forecast.
Well, thank you for the question. In my opinion, actually there are no really visible risks inside, but of course our forecast is based on a quite optimistic outlook on the Eurozone and the global economy. And this forecast, or this assumption, is based on the expectations of analysts. We don't produce our own forecast of the foreign demand and the foreign economy and Eurozone growth. So should there be a less positive development on the side of the foreign demand and the global economy, then of course our forecast would turn out to be too optimistic too. But so far, I don't identify any strong signals that this forecast would be biased to over-optimistic side. The second thing might be is concerning the domestic economy. As Tomáš mentioned, there is a quite strong tightening on the labor market. You see the record low, in fact, record low even in the EU context, unemployment rate, very tight labor market, and gradually accelerating wage growth into domestic economy. So one part of our forecast is based on the assumption there will be that given the quite strong capital formation seen during the previous quarters, there might be some effect on labor capital shift and some effect on the productivity growth and effectiveness growth. And that should curb to some extent the inflationary pressures from the tight labor market. Should this not be materialized, then of course that potentially there might be slightly higher inflationary pressures in the future. But we assume that this effect will work and that will lead taming the inflationary pressures to some extent in the upcoming quarters. Is it enough?
Yeah, it's really an open question to all of you.
Yeah, thank you.
What you personally see there is here.
So thank you very much. Let me first maybe state again that the bank board assessed the risks of the forecast as balanced, and I fully share this. But if you ask me to look for extra risks on the downside, then I would agree with Wojciech Benda that I would probably see them mainly in the external environment. I would mention two things. One, potential geopolitical risks, which could be many, and I will not name them here. We all read the press, and we could all imagine what it could be. We don't want them, of course, but there could happen something which is definitely out of reach of our control. And the second element, in my view, could be the exchange rate development euro-dollar. There could be a potential risk and implications for the ECB policy. So, but this is only under, being forced to look for something.
I mean risk.
Thank you. Mr. Schindel, can you maybe just remind your question and elaborate on it a bit?
On page 27, there's a composition of change in interest rate forecast. There is a gray column, short-term exchange rate forecast, which suggests that 3 months PRIBOR should be some by 20, even 30 basis higher. I just didn't get it.
Yeah, I understand this question. Actually, the exchange rate assumption or near-term forecast for the first quarter of this year is a bit weaker than what was in the previous forecast. But it's even more weak compared to what the model would deliver itself, because it would be pushed to a stronger level by the faster growth in corporate investment, faster growth of labor efficiency, coupled with more expansionary ECB's policy. So without us as humans inserting this near-term assumption into the forecast, the model itself would be even stronger exchange rate, would have even a stronger exchange rate for the first quarter of this year than the previous forecast. And then the model sees this as a kind of depreciation exchange rate shock, and you can cross-check it with the sensitivity scenario that such a one-off shock remains in the interest rate path roughly for 4 or 5 quarters, and this is exactly what you get in the decomposition chart. It's a kind of impulse response of the model to an unexpected one-off exchange rate shock.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Yes. Marek Dřímal.
Marek Dřímal, Komerční banka. Do you continue to see, or do you see at all, any macroprudential risks stemming from the real estate market, for instance? The point is, Do you think it is more appropriate for the central bank to tighten monetary policy, or is it more appropriate for the economy to tighten monetary conditions via rates or via FX? And the obvious question is, do you prefer to tighten monetary policy via rates or via FX? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Is there anybody else? Yes, Mr. Schindel?
We are after general elections in autumn. We have some government. This government something proposed. We know that this government is in demission, but I would like to ask you if you see some risk from the future fiscal policy. Yeah, because if you look at the fiscal balances, you forecast them very large. GDP growth is likely to be very large. So I can easily imagine that politicians will approve some fiscal easing in forthcoming years, or quarters even maybe. Yeah, so do you share the view, or did you discuss any fiscal policy risks?
Thank you. And the final one, yes, please.
Carlos Galindo, Deutsche Bank. Good morning. Thank you very much for slide 27, because you preempted lots of questions by putting this slide. It is wonderful. The problem now is that we want even more. So in terms of the initial state, so one can see the dynamic effects of essentially the impulse of the initial condition. But if you could elaborate yet once more exactly what are the drivers of those of the initial conditions there, and kind of a cross-check with slide 13, which is also a really nice chart, where I mean it is seen here that that you are assuming essentially no labor augmented productivity shock, right? So the initial condition here is not necessarily including any productivity shock coming from this spell of investment that you are actually forecasting, which if we go back to go back in time to the previous spell of investment, that you have a corresponding increase on labor efficiency. And just in general, if you could describe, just briefly enumerate what are the current shocks injected into the system, because I'm guessing there are just multiple shocks. Just enumerate them and to sort of briefly talk about their nature. And if obviously you didn't put the composition of the FX exchange rate impulse, but I will be curious as to what's the dynamic effect of your, like, let's say you put judgment on the first quarter of the koruna appreciation, making it weaker than it would have been otherwise, given the model predictions, but it clearly has also a dynamic effect on it, right? So if the dynamic effect is, for example, a wave such as the one that we're looking at, we see in the interest rate, then that means that you actually injected dynamically. It is the integral of that had a lot of effect on the message that you're giving to the markets in terms of how much koruna appreciation you're expecting. And then obviously I'm guessing that's giving you a little bit of room and leeway in terms of letting you do the tightening via the interest rate channel. Sorry, wave many things together there, but hopefully something comes out. Thank you.
Thank you for a complex question. I think the first question by Marek Jimal goes to Marek Mora and Wojciech Benda. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. On the microprudential risks, yes, of course, we do see them. We also speak about them quite openly. We speak about them in our financial stability reports. We published a shortened version, I don't know if it was last week or 2 weeks ago, so you can find it there. We are quite transparent about it. We are of the view that to cope with these risks, we should mainly use also macroprudential instruments to this end. And you know that we try now, for instance, to get a new law on the Czech National Bank exactly to give us more powers in this domain. Let's see how successful we will be with that. But if you ask us if we think it's better to cope with these risks via rates or foreign exchange. Obviously, if I leave aside the question of that the first thing should be macroprudential measures, then it should be interest rates. Of course, and whenever we can with the monetary policy measures to help also the financial stability, we do it. So it is one of the things which we always keep in mind. But it doesn't mean that the foreign exchange channel does not help at all. It does. It helps as well. But in my view, the interest rates are more direct, and it translates more directly and copes with these risks a bit better. As for the question of Mr. Schindel on the risks linked to future fiscal policy, first, the board did not discuss them at all. I must say that I didn't think about it so much. The only thing, but it's now very creative, would be that, let's say, if we get a very new political situation which would need to lead us to new elections, then maybe politicians would start to be very creative, and maybe something could be produced also in the area of fiscal policy, but otherwise we don't see any imminent risk.
I think Marek addressed quite a comprehensive answer. I just add several points. We are in a comfortable zone now, since as the monetary policy and the macroprudential policy is heading in the same direction, so they are not in the contradiction. Second, using interest rate as a tool for a macroprudential policy, it's not sufficient, of course, because if you would like to tame the current growth of lending by interest rate, you will see huge tightening in interest rates. This is not possible. It would kill the economy, in fact. So that's why we prefer the macroprudential tools we use. We have increased the countercyclical buffer as of 2019, I think 1.25. We addressed the recommendations regarding the loan-to-value, DTI, DSTI. As Marek said, we would really appreciate if this would be implemented into the law so that it would be our tool. And so far it seems that the banks are respecting the recommendations. In case they don't, of course, we have another tool, which is Pillar 2 capital requirement, that we can use in the particular cases not against, but for particular cases of particular participants of the financial market that would not respect our recommendation. As regards the fiscal risks, we mostly maintain a gentleman agreement. We don't make strong comment regarding the government risks, and we expect they don't mention risks stemming from monetary policy. But of course, I think the best guess regarding the future development of the fiscal input into the economy is mentioned in the economy. Judging from the past, so far the Czech governments were always assumed by the foreign analysts as a quite conservative and quite well behaving, if I can say that, regarding the public deficits and the debt. You see that now so far we have one of the lowest debt in the EU. We have the positive fiscal gap, and we have the positive structural gap as well. So I don't see so far no big risk stemming from the fiscal side in the horizon. Thank you.
Thanks to both gentlemen, and I'm convinced that Mr. Tomáš Holub is the right person to comment on the final question posed by Mr. Galindo. Thank you.
Well, I'm not convinced, but I will try. Maybe the right person would actually be Karel Musil. I think last time I mentioned to you that Tibor Hlédik departed from our bank to join the Vienna Institute, and I promised that in 1 quarter I would be able to tell you who is the new head of our forecasters, and it's Karel who is here. So I'm sure that many of you will have a chance to cooperate with him in the future. Maybe he would be able to answer better, but he's not in this front part of the table and he wasn't expecting any questions. So I'll try to do it myself. I would warn against trying to interpret the initial conditions as an impulse response. For the exchange rate, it's a one variable which we highlight in the chart, and it's really a kind of impulse response. While the initial state, it's a bag of many different pieces of information. Everything that arrived about the domestic economy during the quarter, so wages, GDP, but not just the headline figure, also the particular structure of what was driving the growth, domestic inflation, again, not just the overall number, but also the composition. And the first thing that we do in the forecasting process is that we take all those pieces of information together, we take our model, and we try to interpret the new data with the model. And this interpretation is always to some extent judgmental. Okay, one debate that we had this time, we observed higher growth of corporate investment. Is it likely to lead to faster productivity growth? Probably yes, but when, by how much? And we have to decide somehow on this, and this is part of the initial state estimation. As regards this particular link between investment and labor efficiency, the decomposition chart is actually change between this forecast and the previous one. It's not like a decomposition of how much we deviate from the long-term steady state of the model. It's one forecast against the other, and it basically takes the small bars in chart 26 and decomposes it into the factors behind it. And compared to the previous forecast, we actually assume faster labor efficiency growth because we had a discussion about this observed growth in corporate investment, and we agreed in our team of experts that this is likely to have a positive contribution to labor efficiency growth. At the same time, we admit that we don't know the exact magnitude. It's part of the risk regarding the strengths of current and future inflation pressures on the domestic economy. On the one hand, we think that wage growth could be more persistent in the tight labor market, but on the other hand, maybe labor productivity will be increasing faster than what we assume. So these two risks combine in an uncertainty which goes both ways. Karel, did I respond correctly? Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Tomáš, for coping with the challenge. And let me open the final round of questions. So you have the last chance to ask. Yes, please.
Thank you. Corona overboatness was kind of a word very topical for many, many months. And today I haven't heard it so far. Obviously, it might be your decision, might not be your decision, but what's your thinking now? Are we having a clearer picture? Are we less worried now? And that kind of implicitly feeds back to my question in about your confidence in your FX forecasts.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Jan Vejmělek.
Jan Vejmělek, Komerční banka. Several board members, including Governor Rusnok and Vojta Benda, repeatedly expressed a view or wish to have monetary policy rates to the neutral within 1 or 2 years. The interest rates path presented by Tomáš is far from this. So my question is, how comfortable are you as a policymakers with interest rate path presented by Tomáš, and when do you see we will be close to the neutral levels? Thank you.
And the very last one, okay.
Michal Šoltés, Roklen. Let me ask a follow question about the labor productivity. It's not clear, at least to me, how the increased investment can map to higher productivity. So if you have any data you can add, or if you can talk something about these things, thank you.
Okay, so both Wojciech Benda and Marek Homora would like to comment on the first question regarding corona overboughtness.
Well, for this question will be the best director of our Department of Trading, but I will try to answer your question. Yes, the word disappeared, and to be honest, we discussed it as well, whether the effect of overboughtness of corona still works or not, and the situation is less clear than it was a quarter ago. I think that the structure of participants on the market has changed. And from the short-term speculators, it switched to long-term investors. So that is still in the pipeline. Maybe that the effect of overboughtness will arise soon or later during the running of time, and it would result probably in some temporary currency depreciation, but it's hard to predict this. And maybe it's just the problem was partly melted by the fact that came the exporters who hedge themselves, and they are really in the market. And maybe the problem of overboughtness of corona didn't disappear, it just was forwarded to the future. But we don't know. We will have to, and I think it's mostly also your job to predict what will be the future development and what the effect will be of the if there is the effect of overboughtness of the corona, and how you should tell your strategy to your clients. But this is our best guess. We have mentioned today our FX forecast. As regards then was the neutral interest rate, right? Yeah, this is a theoretical concept, and which, of course, it's associated with the long-term stability, or long-term neutral economic state of the economy, like being in the potential no extra external shocks and so on. But of course, we don't live in the ideal world. So of course, it still holds. We have re-estimated, maybe Tomáš will correct me, we have, our monetary department re-estimated neutral real interest rate last year, and it seems it's somewhere, it declined a little bit, in somewhere between 0.6 to 1%. So adding to this the inflation target of 2%, so the neutral interest rate is somewhere between 2.6 or 3%. But I will be very cautious by mentioning this, but always when I mention it somewhere, everybody is stampeding to the email and writing the client, so that's the target of the central bank in the near-term future. So, as you said, we have declined, in fact, the forecast for the 2-year horizon, and we are not reaching the neutral interest rate in the horizon of 2019. But as I mentioned, regarding the exchange rate, the band around the central line of the forecast is widening with the rising uncertainty into the future. So we can reach the neutral interest rate, or we can be below the forecast in the 2-year horizon. We will see. But this concept, this theoretical concept, and this estimate still holds. But I am modest. I don't really do everything just to see 3% interest rate in some visible horizon. We have to respect the development of the external shocks and the domestic economy. And we can be, we were about this in 2008. It was 3.75, I think. I was not there in the bank, so I can remember. But we were about this because we were facing more inflationary pressures, and the economy has to be, and the economy needed tighter monetary conditions, but we can be even below. But this theoretical concept still holds, and according to our assumptions, it's a little bit lower than 3%, it's somewhere between 2.6 and 3%, and that's true. Is it the answer to your question?
First, on the overboughtness, when you look correctly at our forecast, you will see that we consider the exchange rate as one of the risks of the forecast, and we consider it in a very symmetric manner, which implicitly means that we do not think about overboughtness in the same way as we did before. Why do we do so? I think many arguments were brought by Wojciech Benda. I would add to it that, you know, we are now, how many, almost 10 months after the exchange rate commitment finished, and we also have passed several milestones on this way where we always thought that something major could happen, and it did not happen. There was any drama there. It was the end of June where we thought maybe some positions were built up in a manner linked to the previous, you know, soft commitment, that at the end of the June last year something could happen. It didn't. In September last year, where these huge volumes of Ministry of Finance bonds were matured, we also expected, and many of you wrote papers about it and studies, that something could happen there. It didn't. At the end of the year, the same story. So we think now it's the time not to think about the overboughtness in the same way as we did before. Now on the second question, it was not directly addressed to me. I never made such a statement, but I would say in general terms that obviously it should be our aim to bring the situation back to normal, and part of the normal is not only that we start publishing the exchange rate path and that we do other things, that we start increasing the interest rate, but it would be also that the real interest rate gets positive, as Vojta just said. But when it will happen, we don't know, obviously. I think what is true that our main target is not to achieve the interest rate of 3% as soon as possible. Our main target is to have the inflation at our target. And the rest remains to be seen.
Thank you, Marek. And Tomáš wanted to add a comment on the neutral interest rates, I guess, and then if he can continue with replying to Mr. Šolté's question.
Yeah, I wanted to add something because the question by Jan Vejmělek reminded me of a question by Carlos that I didn't answer, and it was which of the shocks. It's the biggest one now that we have in the model. And if I interpret the question, the word shock as which variable, which external variable, or it's far away from its assumed steady state, it's for sure the foreign interest rates. The ECB's policy is still extremely accommodative relative to what we assume is a normal situation. And of course, in such a situation, to get to our own normal level of policy rates, it's very difficult. Actually, in the model, we need to implicitly assume that policy normalization by the ECB in 2019 will be a bit faster than what's implied by the market yield curve to get our own interest rate path as you see it. Without this assumption, it would be even lower. So this external constraint on going back to normal is still there, and we have to take it into account in our model, but then also, of course, in the policy making. And then there was this question on labor productivity and investment. Shall I take
an increase in investment linked to the productivity growth?
Yeah, well, we believe that one reason why the companies have started to invest more is the shortage of available labor. The first stage of recovery was very labor intensive, so companies that were facing growing demand, they simply hired more people, they kept the same machines, and they produced more. But currently, you cannot get much more available labor. Even if you can get it, it becomes more expensive, so it makes sense to do a kind of capital labor substitution. And so you try to get new machines to be able to produce even more with the same number of people. And this is something that you can view as a kind of productivity increases. Most probably you also try to buy more productive machines than the old ones that you already have. Of course, it's very hard to back this by data. We can go into sectoral breakdown. We see that the increase in investment was in corporate sector. We can disaggregate this into individual industries. We can see that much of the investment went into machinery and equipment. But of course, we don't have direct evidence what kind of machinery are the companies exactly buying. So in the end, it's necessarily judgmental to transform this information into the model, but we believe that there should be some positive impact of the increased investment in the corporate sector on productivity growth.
Thank you. And before I close this session, let me give the floor to Wojciech Benda, who would like to return maybe to his to the years he himself was an analyst and would like to ask a question.
Thank you, Markéta. Yeah, it's my first opportunity sitting on this side of the table, because previously I spent many sessions sitting among you guys, and I was putting questions. So this is my question to you. When I was reading the poll we do among the analysts, and which is always published also the result in the inflation report. The same, when I was reading this morning and procrastinating with your research reports and reading your reaction to our decision, I mentioned one thing, that you mostly are more, you expect less visible appreciation of koruna, and you expect more tightening on the interest rates. Can anybody of you answer me or explain me the difference from our forecast? What do you think is behind the difference between the central bank's view and the analyst's view? But of course, I know everybody has a different explanation and different view, but just putting in question. If nobody wants to answer, no matter, I will ask you face to face. Thank you.
Jaromír Šintel.
So I will not try to answer for all here, but for example, from my perspective, I think that your productivity expectations are too high. If I look where the CNB was maybe wrong regarding forecasting, was the still expected easing of employment growth, despite employment actually surprised on the upside for many quarters. So I think this productivity can be, let's say, some explanation. And frankly, maybe also some bank members fuel the expectations of interest rate hikes, because some of you talk about 50, some of them 75 basis hike in Q4 2017. Yes, so maybe some of these also fuel the expectations of interest rate tightening.
Yeah, you mentioned probably my comments from October. Well, some
there
of
were more members, not only you. Yeah? There were more members.
Actually, since I said in October that if there is no change in exchange rate, if there is no additional tightening from the exchange rate, I could see possibly 75 basis points. Since then, koruna, I don't think it was not because of my comments, but the koruna appreciated by 2%. So it added really the 50 basis points, and we added another 50. So in fact, so far I'm quite satisfied with the development. So, but of course, it would be more appreciated probably in line with the assessment of the financial stability if the tightening would go through the interest rate. But we cannot choose the world. We have to accept the world as it is. So that's it. Thank you.
Viktor Zeisler would like to react.
Yeah, just maybe one of the pieces which might be the difference between our forecast and the CNB forecast is that is the pass-through from the exchange rate into inflation. We kind of believe it is asymmetric and non-linear. I know it is very difficult to model it, especially like all of us using the linear and symmetric models. But in the current state of the economy, with current state of output and the demand, we think that the pass-through would be a bit weaker, and especially with relatively continuous appreciation path, the pass-through would be just weaker.
Helena Horská.
Today I have no question, so I have to at least answer the question. So thank you for time. Of course, maybe you know that more or less in the first half of this year we are in line with your forecast. So we are one of the aggressive analysts that we are expecting aggressive corona appreciation during the first half of this year. But then, exactly, we are in line with your stressed scenario. So we are expecting ahead of ECB September monetary policy meeting some correction of Czech koruna. And this is why we were expecting another hikes from your side. So we are like in line with your stressed scenario. So this is exactly what we are expecting, and we are not ready to change our view, so we are following your stressed scenario.
Thank you, Helena, for your comprehensive answer. Thank you.
Okay, so as we have run out of time, let me close this session by thanking to all our speakers and also by thanking to you for coming and taking part in the discussion. We will be looking forward to meeting you here again in May. Thanks and goodbye.